A stranger showed up with my dad's darkest secrets: an affair, betrayal, and a ruined legacy. Now, my family is shattered beyond repair. I'm a 25-year-old guy, and my family has always been close. Growing up, we were one of those families that had dinner together every night, went on road trips, and always had each other's backs. My dad, who's in his 50s, was the anchor of our family. He's the kind of guy everyone respects: quiet, hardworking, and dependable. He built our home and a successful family business from scratch, and people in our small town looked up to him. To me and my older brother, he was the kind of dad who didn't talk much about emotions or his past, but he was always there when it mattered. My mom, on the other hand, is the social one. She's warm and outgoing, the kind of person who knows everyone in town, and always has something comforting to say. They've been married for over 30 years, and while they're very different, they always seem like a solid team, or so I thought. The first crack appeared a few weeks ago when my dad got a phone call from a man named Adam. I was in the living room scrolling through my phone when I noticed my dad standing in the kitchen, holding his phone to his ear with a strange expression. He wasn't saying much, just nodding and grunting. When he hung up, I asked him who it was, and he just muttered, "An old friend, that was it." Over the next few days, Dad wasn't himself. He seemed restless, pacing around the house and snapping at little things. He spent more time in his office than usual, and whenever I asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off. My mom noticed too, but when I brought it up to her, she just said, "He's probably stressed about work." A week later, Adam called again. This time, Dad didn't even try to hide his irritation. He stepped out into the backyard to take the call, but the walls in our house are thin, and I could hear bits of the conversation. Adam wanted to meet, and Dad was clearly uncomfortable with the idea. He eventually agreed to meet him, but insisted it had to be private. That's when things started to feel really off. The night before the meeting, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. My mom was telling my dad that meeting Adam might not be a good idea, and he snapped back that he didn't have a choice. It was one of the few times I'd ever heard them argue. My dad, usually so composed, sounded almost scared. The next day, Adam didn't wait for the meeting. He showed up at our house unannounced. I wasn't home at the time, but when I walked in, I saw a man sitting in our living room with my dad and mom. He looked rough, like he'd had a hard life, but there was something about him that seemed familiar. Maybe it was the way he held himself, or the way he looked at my dad. Adam wasted no time. As soon as I walked in, he started talking about things I'd never heard before. Stories about my dad's past that didn't match the man I thought I knew. He talked about how he and my dad had been close friends when they were younger, practically like brothers. But then, Adam mentioned a woman, Rebecca, who had been in love with my dad back in the day. My dad hadn't just left her behind. According to Adam, there had been an affair. Adam didn't stop there. He claimed that my dad's success wasn't all due to hard work. He said there were secrets, financial ones, that my dad had kept hidden for decades. Adam said he'd helped my dad cover up something big, and now he wanted to set the record straight. My dad was furious, telling Adam to leave and calling him a liar. But Adam didn't back down. By the time Adam left, our family was in shock. My mom, usually calm and collected, looked like she'd seen a ghost. My brother and I were trying to piece together what we just heard, but Dad wouldn't say a word. He just went to his office and slammed the door. Later that night, my mom admitted that she knew about the affair. She said it happened before they were married, but she hadn't known all the details until now. She said she chose to forgive my dad because she believed people could change, and she didn't want to destroy our family over something from so long ago. But now, with Adam bringing everything back up, it felt like all the wounds she'd tried to bury were being reopened. As for my dad, he refused to talk to us. Every time I tried to ask him about Adam or Rebecca or the business, he shut me down. "It's in the past," he kept saying. But Adam didn't seem like the kind of guy who would let things stay in the past. In just a few days, our family went from being close-knit and steady to feeling like a house of cards, ready to collapse. None of us knew what was true anymore. About my dad. About our family. About the life we'd all built together. And this was only the beginning. Update 1. After Adam left, the house was heavy with silence. My dad locked himself in his office, and none of us had the courage to approach him. My brother, who's 2 years older than me, called later that night. He sounded calm, but had a certain tone that told me he wasn't surprised. He told me that, growing up, he'd always felt like there was something off about the way Dad avoided talking about his past. He brought up times when Dad would deflect questions, or get strangely defensive about his younger years. Things I hadn't noticed as a kid, but started to remember now. The next morning, I decided to confront my dad. When I knocked on his office door, he didn't answer, so I just walked in. He looked up from his desk, his face tight with anger. I asked him point blank if what Adam had said was true. He didn't yell, but his tone was sharp. He said Adam was a liar. Someone who was jealous and bitter. He didn't elaborate, just told me to let it go and stop bringing it up. Then he stood, grabbed his wallet, and left the house without saying another word. My mom was in the kitchen, acting like everything was fine. When I asked her what she thought about Adam's claims, she didn't give me a straight answer. She said that sometimes people from the past try to stir up trouble when they see someone doing well. Her words sounded rehearsed. And the way she avoided my eyes made it clear she knew more than she was letting on. That afternoon, the tension boiled over. My parents had their first big fight in years. It started with my mom telling my dad that he couldn't just ignore what Adam had said and hope it would go away. My dad, who rarely raised his voice, started yelling. He accused my mom of not being supportive and said Adam was only trying to destroy their family. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, hearing every word but unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. When their voices dropped, I could hear my mom crying. I'd never seen her like that before. Later that evening, I cornered her in the living room. I asked her directly if Adam's story was true. She looked exhausted, like the fight had drained her, and told me she'd explain everything when the time was right. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was clear she wasn't ready to say more. Adam called me the next day. I didn't even know how he got my number. He said he wasn't done telling the story, and that if we didn't take him seriously, he'd have no choice but to reveal everything on his own terms. He didn't sound angry or aggressive, just matter of fact. He also dropped a bombshell. My dad's business wasn't as clean as we all believed. According to Adam, some of my dad's early success came from shady deals and underhanded tactics. He claimed my dad had stepped on other people to climb the ladder, including one person whose life was ruined as a result. The more Adam talked, the more it felt like our family's entire foundation was crumbling. I didn't know what to believe, but Adam didn't seem like someone who was making things up for fun. He sounded too confident, too sure of the details. He mentioned Rebecca again, saying that the affair wasn't just a fling, it had real consequences. He claimed Rebecca had been in love with my dad, and that when their relationship ended, it left her life in shambles. She'd been trying to expose him for years, but no one had taken her seriously. That evening, my mom finally admitted she knew about the affair. She told me it had happened before they got married, and that she chose to forgive my dad because she believed people make mistakes. She said she'd never known the full story about Rebecca or the business, and she didn't want to ruin the family by digging into the past. But the guilt in her voice was obvious. She wasn't just trying to protect my dad, she was protecting all of us. 2 days later, my dad finally broke his silence. He admitted there was some truth to Adam's story. Yes, there had been an affair, and yes, Adam had helped him cover it up. But he denied the part about the business. He said every penny he earned was through hard work, and that Adam was lying about the financial side of things to make himself look better. His tone was defensive, almost desperate, and it didn't do much to convince me. The more I learned, the harder it became to see my dad as the man I'd always looked up to. My brother and I started talking about whether our family's legacy, our home, our business, everything we'd built, was even real. Was it all based on lies and betrayal? Was my dad someone worth defending? Or had he been fooling all of us from the start? By the end of the week, our family felt like strangers living under the same roof. My mom spent most of her time in the bedroom, my dad retreated to his office, and my brother stopped coming over altogether. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore, it was suffocating. And with Adam still looming in the background, I knew this wasn't over. Update 2: After days of tension, I realized that if I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. Adam's story about Rebecca stuck in my head. I didn't know who she was, but I figured someone from my dad's past might have left traces. I started with old photo albums. Dad rarely shared anything from his younger years, but we still had a few albums tucked away in the attic. I spent hours flipping through faded pictures of family gatherings, vacations, and work events. But nothing stood out until I found an envelope tucked between 2 albums. It held a few black and white photos, including one of my dad as a young man standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. She was smiling, and he looked happier than I'd ever seen him. The back of the photo was labeled ST Summer '85. I was sure the S was Rebecca. I didn't know what T stood for, but it didn't matter. This was her. I showed the photo to my mom. She stared at it for a long time before finally saying that Rebecca was my dad's first love. She said they had been inseparable for years, but something happened that tore them apart. She didn't know all the details but admitted that when she and my dad first started dating, she always felt like he was still carrying a torch for Rebecca. My mom confessed that she'd spent their entire marriage wondering if she was enough for him. It was the first time I saw her so vulnerable. Around this time, Adam started calling me again. I wasn't eager to pick up, but I knew ignoring him wouldn't stop him from pushing forward. When I finally answered, Adam said he wanted to clarify something. He claimed Rebecca wasn't just some fling. She'd been deeply in love with my dad, and their breakup wasn't mutual. According to Adam, my dad had made promises to Rebecca that he couldn't keep, and when things ended, it nearly destroyed her. Adam also said he had more to share, but only if my dad didn't come clean on his own. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just the affair. Adam's comments about my dad's business kept gnawing at me. I decided to dig through the family business records, which my dad kept meticulously organized in his office. At first, everything seemed normal. Profit margins, expense reports, payroll records. But then I found a folder marked personal. Inside were old contracts and handwritten notes that didn't add up. Some referenced payments that didn't appear in the official records. And there were vague mentions of a settlement with a former partner. It looked shady, but I didn't have enough context to understand the full picture. I confronted my dad that evening. He was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. When I asked him about the financial records, his face went pale. He didn't deny anything outright, but said it wasn't as bad as it looked. He told me he'd made some tough decisions early in his career to secure a future for the family. When I pushed for details, he shut down, retreating to his office again. Adam called me the next day, seemingly aware that I was starting to piece things together. He told me a story about a man named Kevin, who had been my dad's business partner when the company first started. According to Adam, my dad had sabotaged Kevin's career to gain full control of the business. Adam claimed my dad manipulated contracts and spread rumors that eventually pushed Kevin out of the industry entirely. It sounded too dramatic to be true, but Adam promised he had proof. Meanwhile, the strain on my parents' relationship was becoming impossible to ignore. My mom started sleeping in the guest room, and they barely spoke to each other. One evening, she broke down and admitted that she'd been living in fear for years, terrified that my dad's secrets would one day destroy our family. She said she had always hoped the truth would stay buried, but now it was clear that wasn't going to happen. My brother, who had been avoiding the house, finally called to tell me he couldn't support my dad anymore. He said he felt betrayed, not just by the lies, but by the fact that Dad had let us believe in a version of him that wasn't real. He told me he was cutting ties until Dad came clean about everything. Adam's final call was the most chilling. He gave me an ultimatum: either we help him expose the truth, or he'd do it himself. He said he had evidence that could ruin my dad's reputation and possibly lead to legal consequences. Adam seemed more determined than ever to make sure my dad paid for his mistakes. By this point, it felt like every piece of our family's life was unraveling. The business, the marriage, the legacy my dad had built, it all seemed fragile and false. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but I knew one thing: Adam wasn't going away, and my dad couldn't keep running from the past. It didn't take long for everything to come crashing down. My dad finally admitted more than he ever had before. One night, after dinner, he sat us down, me, my mom, and my brother, and said he wanted to set things straight. He acknowledged the affair with Rebecca and admitted Adam's story about the business wasn't entirely false. He claimed he didn't sabotage Kevin outright, but he did take advantage of opportunities that came from Kevin's downfall. He tried to frame it as a necessary step to secure our family's future, but it didn't land the way he thought it would. My mom didn't take the news well. She stared at him, almost frozen, before standing up and walking out of the room. She didn't say anything, but her face said it all. Later that night, I heard her crying in the guest room. It wasn't the first time, but this was different. She'd always seemed like the glue holding our family together, but now she looked like she didn't know what was worth holding onto anymore. The next day, my brother came over. He wasn't interested in hearing more excuses from my dad. He told me we needed to confront him together and demand that he take responsibility for everything. I wasn't sure what that meant. What would taking responsibility even look like? My brother was convinced that if Dad didn't come clean to the community and the people he'd wronged, the rest of us would be dragged down with him. Meanwhile, the rumors had already started spreading. Friends and neighbors were hearing whispers about my dad's past, and I began getting messages from people asking if the stories were true. Some were genuinely concerned, but others were just digging for gossip. It didn't help that Adam wasn't staying quiet. He'd started posting vague comments online, hinting at the secrets he knew. It wasn't long before people connected the dots and realized he was talking about my dad. Adam's threats to go public were no longer just threats. He reached out again, this time saying he had a full story ready to release to the media if my dad didn't acknowledge the truth. Adam seemed determined to make sure my dad couldn't sweep this under the rug. At the same time, it felt like he was relishing the chaos he was creating. In an attempt to salvage what was left of our family, we decided to try therapy. It was my mom's idea, though I wasn't sure it would work. The sessions were tense. My dad mostly sat in silence, while my mom vented years of frustration. She talked about how she'd spent their entire marriage feeling like there was a shadow hanging over them, even when things seemed perfect on the surface. My brother aired his grievances too, accusing my dad of being selfish and manipulative. I mostly listened, trying to make sense of everything. The therapy sessions didn't fix anything. If anything, they exposed more cracks in our relationships. My dad showed some regret but refused to take any steps to make amends with the people he'd hurt. He kept saying things like, "I did what I had to do for us," as if that justified everything. At home, I kept finding more lies. I went through more of the business records and discovered that some of the early investors in the company had been bought out under questionable circumstances. One name stood out, a man who'd sued my dad years ago but mysteriously dropped the case. It felt like every new detail chipped away at the image of the hard-working man I'd grown up admiring. My mom started opening up about their early years together. She told me about times when my dad would get strange calls late at night or disappear for hours without explanation. She said she'd always known there were things he wasn't telling her but chose to ignore them because she wanted to believe in the life they were building. Hearing her stories made me realize just how much she'd sacrificed to keep our family intact. As if things weren't bad enough, the stories started leaking online. Someone, probably Adam, posted a detailed account of my dad's past on a local community forum. The post included specific accusations about the business, the affair, and even the fallout with Kevin. People in the community began to pick sides. Some defended my dad, saying everyone makes mistakes, while others called him a fraud. The backlash was relentless, and our family's reputation, once spotless, was in shambles. Adam, for his part, wasn't hiding anymore. He made it clear that his motivation wasn't just revenge, it was personal. He talked about how my dad's actions had ruined lives, including his own. He painted a picture of a man who'd stopped at nothing to get ahead, regardless of who got hurt along the way. Adam's words hit hard, especially when I realized how many people believed him. By now, I had to make a choice. Did I stand by my family and try to protect the legacy we'd built, or did I side with Adam and help expose the truth? My mom was torn, too. She wanted to protect her marriage but couldn't ignore the moral weight of what my dad had done. My brother had already made his decision. He was done with my dad and didn't care about the fallout. As we approached what felt like an inevitable confrontation, I realized our family might never recover from this. The damage was too deep, and the truth too messy. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The life we'd known was over. Update 4: I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. Everything had come to a head, and it was time to confront my dad. Late one evening, after another tense, silent dinner, I asked him to sit down. My brother joined me, though I could tell he was already checked out emotionally. My mom lingered in the hallway, watching but not stepping in. My dad seemed resigned, like he knew this moment was inevitable. I started by asking him, once and for all, to tell us everything. No more half-truths, no more excuses, just the full story. For a long time, he didn't say anything, just stared at the table. Then he began to talk. He admitted to sabotaging Kevin's career, though he claimed it wasn't as malicious as Adam had made it sound. According to him, Kevin had been struggling, and my dad saw an opportunity to buy him out. He didn't deny spreading rumors about Kevin's work ethic, but insisted it was just business strategy. Then he moved on to Rebecca. He admitted they'd been in love, and that he'd made promises to her he couldn't keep. When their relationship ended, she was devastated, and Adam had stepped in to pick up the pieces. He admitted to using Adam to cover up the affair, including fabricating a story to ensure Rebecca wouldn't come forward. He looked genuinely regretful when he mentioned Rebecca, but when he tried to defend his actions as necessary for the family, my brother stood up and walked out of the room. My mom, who'd been silent up until this point, finally exploded. She told my dad she'd spent decades ignoring red flags and putting up with his secrets for the sake of the family, but she was done now. She demanded that he leave the house immediately. My dad tried to argue, but she didn't back down. The shouting match that followed was the loudest I'd ever heard them. My brother and I stood frozen, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. In the end, my dad stormed upstairs to pack a bag. By the next morning, he was gone. With my dad out of the house, the fallout hit us hard. Adam became something of a local hero. His posts online gained traction, and people started rallying around his version of the story. Old friends and business associates began turning against my dad, while others tried to stay neutral, but it was clear our family was now a source of gossip and judgment. I even overheard someone at the grocery store speculating about how much of our family's wealth was dirty money. My brother and I, despite our earlier tension, started to reconcile. He admitted that while he was angry, he didn't want to see the rest of us suffer for Dad's mistakes. We agreed to support our mom as much as we could, though our views on Dad's actions remained divided. Therapy sessions continued, but they felt more like a way to air grievances than to heal. My mom was still furious, my brother was distant, and I was just trying to hold everything together. The family business, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden. Rumors about its shady origins made it difficult to maintain trust with clients, and we started losing contracts, with legal fees piling up. Thanks to Adam threatening to sue for damages, it became clear we might have to sell the business. My mom tried to hold on to it as a legacy for us, but the stress was wearing her down. Meanwhile, my dad was starting a new life in another city. He moved in with an old friend and picked up a job doing consulting work. I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances, but he didn't reach out much. When he did call, it was brief and awkward. He apologized but didn't seem interested in making amends. It felt like he was trying to move on without fully facing the damage he'd caused. Adam, unsurprisingly, wasn't finished. He continued posting updates online, framing himself as someone seeking justice. I wasn't sure if he was doing it for closure or out of spite, but either way, it kept the story alive. More people came forward with stories about my dad, old colleagues, former friends, even a few distant relatives. Each new revelation added to the weight we were carrying. Amid all this, my own relationships started to suffer. My boyfriend, who had been supportive at first, began pulling away. The constant stress and drama were taking a toll, and I couldn't blame him. Every conversation seemed to circle back to my family, and I could tell he was getting tired of it. As weeks turned into months, we started to rebuild, but it wasn't easy. My mom focused on downsizing, selling the house, and moving into a smaller place. My brother and I helped where we could, though he was already talking about moving out of state to get a fresh start. The shadow of my dad's actions loomed over everything, but we were learning to live with it. Eventually, I decided to visit my dad one last time. I wasn't sure what I wanted from the meeting, closure maybe, or just a chance to say goodbye to the man I'd once admired. When I saw him, he looked older, almost frail. We talked for hours, but the conversation felt hollow. He apologized again, but seemed more focused on defending his choices than taking responsibility. As I left, I realized the man I'd grown up idolizing was gone. What was left was someone I'd barely recognized. Adam kept his promise. Within weeks, he filed a lawsuit against my dad, dragging our family business into the mess. He claimed damages stemming from the financial fallout caused by my dad's sabotage of Kevin's career. The case attracted attention, especially since Adam had been so vocal online about exposing the truth. It wasn't long before the media picked up the story, turning our family drama into public spectacle. The lawsuit forced everything out into the open. Documents, testimonies, and even emails from decades ago were submitted as evidence. The more that came to light, the harder it became to hold on to any illusions about my dad. We learned about deals made under the table, payments to keep certain people quiet, and instances where my dad had taken advantage of vulnerable individuals to get ahead. It wasn't just about Kevin anymore, there were others who had suffered because of his actions. The business we thought had been built on hard work turned out to be a house of cards propped up by manipulation. As if the lawsuit wasn't enough, Rebecca came forward during the trial. She confirmed many of Adam's claims, including details about the affair and the emotional toll it had taken on her life. She described how she had been left to pick up the pieces while my dad moved on without a second thought. But she didn't stop there. She added new revelations that even Adam hadn't mentioned. It turned out that my dad had promised to financially support Rebecca during a difficult time and then backed out when it became inconvenient. Her testimony was devastating, and it painted a picture of a man who had not only betrayed her trust but actively harmed her future. My dad showed up to court, but his regret felt hollow. He apologized when prompted, but it was clear he wasn't ready to take full responsibility for everything that had happened. He stuck to his narrative about doing what he had to do for the family, as if that justified the hurt he'd caused. Watching him try to defend himself was painful. The man who had once seemed so strong and capable now looked small and defensive, a shadow of who I thought he was. The fallout divided the family even further. My mom, who had been holding herself together for months, finally admitted she couldn't keep defending my dad. She said she needed to focus on herself and let go of the marriage she'd spent years fighting to protect. Some relatives, especially those who benefited from the business, still supported my dad, claiming Adam and Rebecca were just bitter and out for revenge. Others, like my brother, chose to sever ties completely. The rift felt permanent, and it was hard to imagine a future where we'd all be in the same room again. Meanwhile, the business was in freefall. With the lawsuit draining our resources and our reputation in ruins, it became clear we couldn't recover. Clients backed out, contracts were terminated, and our employees started looking for work elsewhere. Eventually, my mom made the difficult decision to sell the business. It wasn't enough to cover all the debts, but it was the only option left. Watching the company my dad had built, flawed as it was, be dismantled piece by piece felt like the end of an era. My dad moved out of state after the trial ended. He found work at a small company, doing something far removed from the life he once led. I heard through the grapevine that he lived alone in a modest apartment, keeping to himself and avoiding contact with most people. He called occasionally, but our conversations were brief and strained. He sounded tired, like someone who had resigned himself to his new reality. Adam, on the other hand, walked away from the lawsuit with a sense of victory. He won a settlement, though it wasn't as much as he'd hoped. Even so, he seemed satisfied knowing he'd exposed my dad and given a voice to people like Rebecca and Kevin. But as much as Adam claimed to want justice, there was no real closure. The damage had been done, and no amount of money or public vindication could undo it. My mom began to heal in her own way. She started volunteering at a local shelter and took up painting, something she'd always wanted to do but never had time for. She struggled with forgiveness, often questioning whether she'd wasted her life on a man who wasn't who she thought he was. But she also found strength in moving forward and creating a life that was hers alone. As for me, the experience left scars I'll carry forever. My relationship with my brother improved as we bonded over the shared chaos, but we both agreed that the family we grew up in was gone. I focused on rebuilding my own life, diving into work and spending more time with friends. My relationship with my boyfriend didn't survive the ordeal, but it taught me to prioritize my own well-being. In the end, I realized some things are better left in the past. Forgiveness is complicated, and moving on doesn't always mean closure. I'll never forget the man my dad used to be, or the man he turned out to be. Our family's legacy is gone, but so is the weight of the lies it was built on. We're moving forward, step by step, even if the shadow of what happened will always be with us.